What's up, everybody? This is Math Done Right with another video for you, and today we're going to be solving quadratic equations with the square root method. So let's remember that a quadratic equation is an equation of the form ax squared plus bx plus c, and a has to not be 0. Now, this method is usually going to mean that b is going to be 0, and we'll see that in the examples that I show you, but let's just kind of go on with how to solve them. So there's kind of 4 steps you want to think about when solving with the square root method. First, we want to isolate the squared term. So whatever is squared, we want to have it on one side of the equation and then everything else on the other side. Then we're going to square root both sides. And when we do that, we can't forget about the plus or minus. Whenever we have something like x squared equals 2 and we take the square root of both sides, that means that x is equal to plus root 2 and x is equal to minus root 2. Because if I square both of those, I get a 2 back. So we have to remember, this is super important here, the plus or minus. And then after we do that, then we just solve for x. Alright, so this first example is going to be x squared minus 5 equals 0. Now, let's notice that this is actually a quadratic equation because I have an x squared term, and that there's no just x term, right? B is 0 here. And because I have that b is 0, I can just solve for x immediately. So what I'm going to do is first isolate the squared term. So I'm going to add 5 to both sides. I get x squared equals 5. Then I square root both sides. And I can't forget about the plus minus, right? So the square and the square root cancel each other out, and I'm left with x equals plus or minus the square root of 5. And those are my 2 solutions. I can just leave it like this, or I can say that x equals positive root 5 and x equals negative root 5. And if I plug both of these back into my original equation, they'll give me 5 minus 5, which is 0. So that's what I was looking for, right? These are my 2 solutions. And if you watched part 1 of, or a similar video solving quadratic equations that I made, this is also a difference of perfect squares. And even though 5 is not a pretty square, it's not like 16, which is the one I did in the video before, I know that the square root of 5 times the square root of 5 gives me 5. And so then I can just get my 2 solutions that way. But this is solving with the square root method, so I don't want to show you that. But I think it's important to realize that there's multiple ways to solve one problem. Alright, so now we're going to look at example 2. And that's going to be x minus 3 squared plus 4 equals 8. Now, step 1, I want to isolate the squared term. Now, I don't have just an x squared, I have an x minus 3 squared, but I still want to isolate this whole thing right here. So what I'm going to do is subtract 4 from both sides. So that gives me x minus 3 equals 8, x minus 3 squared. Whoops, I'm messing this whole thing up. Let's start over. When I subtract 4 from both sides, I get x minus 3 squared equals 4. I think I said that, but I think I wrote it down incorrectly. Anyways, we all make mistakes. We're all human here. Okay, so next step I do is square root both sides. Right, and the square root and the square cancel out on the left side, and that leaves me with x minus 3 equals. Now when I take the square root on the right hand side, I have to have a plus or minus. And the square root of 4 is equal to 2, so I'm going to go down to this next line and say this is plus or minus 2. Now I'm going to bring it back up. And this gives me 2 equations now. I have x minus 3 equals plus 2, and x minus 3 equals negative 2. And I just have to solve for x now, so I add 3 to both sides, and this gives me that x equals 5. And I add 3 to this bottom one, and I get x equals negative 2 plus 3 gives me a plus 1. And those are my two solutions for my quadratic equation. All right, well, that's the square root method for solving a quadratic equation. Remember, you can really only do this if you don't have an x term. And I didn't have an x term in my second example, and I also pointed out in the first example that there is no x term. Yeah, just another way to solve these guys. So, if you liked this video, make sure to like it and subscribe, share with your friends. Thanks for watching. Bye.